the headline findings that Fred has summarised there, they're a sample actually of the headline findings from the different research streams that we've sponsored. Nearly all of those have already been expressed in our various publications, and in particular in the policy briefs, some of which are still outside there for you to see. In thinking about the synthesis, we wanted to address this question, so what? Because this is always the question that comes back to research programs. You know, all very interesting, but so what? What does it mean? What's new here? What does it add up to? And what difference does it make to anything that matters? Heather mentioned new research questions, but actually we're also interested in new practice questions. What does it mean for the whole field of policy and practice around governance in Africa? And curiously, what's come out, I think, out of the synthesis process is that what's most new and what is most important from a practical point of view is actually a fairly sort of abstract summary of what all of those research headlines add up to. Much of what we are reporting agrees with a consensus of experts on governance reform and governance research, which has been accumulating over the last 10 years or so. There is now a substantial consensus among researchers and sort of policy specialists on governance that the good governance agenda, as it was defined at the end of the Cold War, which adds up to saying poor countries need to mimic the best practices of northern institutions. That agenda doesn't work. It isn't realistic. It isn't based on a historically grounded notion of the necessary conditions for successful development. And it causes overload. And you can probably think of a whole series of pieces of writing over the last 5 to 10 years which have made these points, coming from Mary Lee Grindle, Blanche Pritchett, Matt Andrews, and a series of other people. So at the expert level, this is really mainstream now. And what all of those people conclude, using the language of Brian Levy, is that what we need is not the continued promotion of best practice institutions, best practice forms of governance, but forms and institutions which achieve a good fit with the needs and the possibilities of poor developing countries. So the good fit agenda has also been around with us for some time now. I'm not sure that it's had a huge impact on the world of practice, but at least at the level of expert opinion, it's not new. But Mary Lee Grindle wrote a paper, or published a paper last year, which looks at this consensus and argues the experts have been saying we need good fit, that we need to study things case by case, but they haven't actually come up with something that practitioners can use, because practitioners don't have time to study every case individually from scratch. In effect, she says, well, we need some middle-range propositions of a relatively general kind that can guide practice in the future. And we agree with that. And we think that our research will have failed if we can't come up with something that that fits that description. Another but is that despite the fact that good governance has been questioned for some time and the phrase good fit is widely used, most of the recent governance programming supported by donors looks very much like the governance programming that existed before anybody started talking about good fit. There hasn't been much change. a strong impression that both among African reformers and among those designing programs to assist African reformers, people have a real problem actually imagining what to do differently than they've done in the past. It's actually something that Alex Duncan and I find a lot in the political economy training that we do. The answers that people come up with are very much the same as the answers that people came up with 10 or 20 years ago. There is a real problem of imagining what to do differently. So there's something missing in the expert consensus, and perhaps particularly in the way the expert consensus has been translated so far into practice. So our question is, what needs to be added, and what does the sort of sum total of our research work suggest about what needs to be added to good fit? And our answer can be summarized in two sentences, like this. We think it's time to break away from an array of governance improvement initiatives which have in common the assumption that you've got well-intentioned good guys over here and the task is to get everybody else to comply with their wishes. What's missing from those standard approaches is the realization that all actors face serious collective action problems in acting in developmental ways. There are no good guys. I mean, there are good guys, but there are the good guys and the good women have difficulty in acting on their best intentions. Putting that more technically, what we want to say is that despite the sort of consensus around the idea of good fit, most thinking and almost all programming in the governance area remains stuck in one form or another of principal-agent perspective. I'll elaborate a little bit in a moment. We think that both forms, all forms of principal-agent perspective, are in fact unrealistic. And there needs to be more recognition that governance limitations stem from the fact that not only the politicians at the top, but also the people at the grassroots face problems of collective action in acting in their own best interests. This is not a message of doom, because collective action problems are in principle solvable. So what's out? Well, what's out is two things, we would argue. The principal-agent perspective is usually translated into a concept of governance work which says, well, either you act on the supply side or you act on the demand side. What's out, first of all, is the kind of supply-side principal-agent approach which assumes there is a real political commitment somewhere at the top, in the president's office or in the cabinet, real commitments to reform, to improve governance, and the problem is one of compliance further down the chain of command. Most of the traditional style of public sector reform makes that assumption. It has to make that assumption. Much public financial management reform makes that assumption. The assumption that at the top there is a principal who is clearly and in a straightforward sense committed to getting the kind of reforms that are needed for development. That's not a realistic assumption in most places, most of the time. And that's been recognized for some time. Brian Levy wrote in the mid-2000s some quite compelling pieces which said, we can't go on making the assumption that governments are led by developmentally oriented principles. That's just not realistic. problem, which I think Brian Levy now himself recognizes, is that the solution that was produced 10 years ago was to turn that thing on its head and say, oh, well, we've got to become more political, and being more political means assuming that the citizens of the country are developmentally oriented principles, and that the challenge is to get the politicians and the civil servants to comply with the wishes of those development principles at the sort of base of the political system. That needs to be out as well. And less obviously, the thing that needs to be out, and here I think we are pushing the agenda forward, particularly with respect to the findings which, or the conclusions which have been drawn from the previous sort of phase of governance research funded by DFID. Less obviously, also needs to go out the idea that it is a sufficient response to that situation to say, well, we're going to combine supply and demand. We're going to move across the relationship between supply-side governance and demand for good governance. The problem with that solution is that it doesn't put a question mark, it doesn't challenge the basic flaw in the conceptualization which requires there to be a principle, either at the top or at the bottom. What we're saying here does build very strongly on the findings about social accountability of the Centre for the Future State and the Citizenship Centre at IDS. But the implications of that research so far have tended to lead to the conclusion of working across the demand and supply divide. They have not taken the additional step of challenging the principal agent formulation of that problem to bring in the idea that fundamentally there are collective action problems on both sides of the relationship. So what's in is the hardcore collective action concept of Olson and Ostrom, which says that at all levels of the structure of governance for development, there are problems where individuals and groups don't act in what you would think was their own best interests because they fear that any benefits will have to be shared with a range of other people who have not contributed to the effort. And it's worth emphasizing that by arguing that collective action problems need to become more central to the discussion, we are not suggesting that there needs to be a focus on grassroots things and social movements. Collective action problem analysis has been applied in academic research for some time to macro issues to do with the decisions of political elites. Barbara Geddes has a book on public service reform in Latin America, which is now 20 years old, which very productively used that concept. The Gibson et al. Book, which is Ostrom's team, have a discussion of national level reform issues in these terms. And Peter Lewis and Philip Kiefer have written recently about elite level collective action problems as the key to understanding why Nigeria and DRC don't make progress, as you might expect. How does all that relate back to the headline research findings? Well, the idea that there are fundamental collective action problems at the elite level provides a very useful handle on our finding of why it is that there are sometimes developmental forms of patrimonialism in Africa, but also why those experiences, those moments are rather exceptional. It's because under normal circumstances, leaders have serious problems of collective action in doing anything other than orient towards the short term and winning the next election. It takes an acute kind of crisis to allow leaders to overcome that situation. It also provides a powerful, sympathetic, in quotation marks, understanding of why thoroughly bad governance is so common in Africa. It helps us to understand why it is that Kenyan politicians, for example, behave in the way that they do. And it begins to give us a handle on thinking about what might possibly be done about that. We think that addressing collective action problems is a highly practical proposition and provides a good practical alternative to current approaches to social accountability and democratic deepening. Current approaches to these things rely on a naive principal-agent concept of citizens in relation to government. That's not realistic, but working on collective action problems is practical. And last but not least, this kind of thinking provides a way of approaching our original hypothesis about working with the grain of African societies, which is not open to the objection that it's culturalist and makes and sets up indefensible concepts of African culture. We find that often the institutions which do solve the collective action problems which are holding people back involve practical hybrids of modern state forms and things which are congenial and understandable for local people. It's too costly to invent institutions from scratch, and this is why effective institutions tend to borrow from local ways of doing things. That draws quite heavily on Richard's research, which he may elaborate on. If we are right, and if you follow us this far, there are big implications for the development business, for the business of reform within African countries and the business of using foreign assistance to support reform. A feature of the conventional principal-agent approaches in all of their forms, in the top-down form and the bottom-up form, is that it takes reform into generic territory. Deepening democracy or feeding citizen demand with better information or clearer concepts about rights. Quite generic stuff, right? Once you've got the idea, you can do it anyway. Addressing collective action problems is more challenging in that, as Ostrom has been saying as she said all her life, I mean, solutions only work if they deal with the specifics of each situation. Generic solutions to collective action problems tend not to work, and sometimes make things worse. Which means effective development work, effective work on institutions for development requires getting embedded in local situations and acquiring good local knowledge. It implies being highly adaptive. Lance Pritchett and his colleagues have rightly created a bit of a stir recently with papers which have been arguing, actually reviving an old story from the 1980s about the importance of adaptive planning, of planning which is capable of learning from experience and adjusting in the light of better understanding. That clearly is also an implication of all of the things we're saying. Another feature of the conventional principal-agent approaches is that they provide apparent justifications for disbursing large volumes of country programmable aid. Large aid expenditure in country and principal-agent concepts of governance go very nicely together. But there's increasing research evidence that suggests that the act of disbursing aid money can actually do serious harm to the ability to solve collective action problems. The most recent contribution to this is a very good book on Pakistan by Mahmouda Bano. Donor funds can actually kill existing successful collective action at the local level. So from all of this, we draw some conclusions, and the synthesis report says these in a rather sort of brief way. I'm going to say them in a slightly longer way, but this is the sort of discussion that we need to be having, I think. First, we need to start persuading those who form the basic framework of development assistance in the North, and perhaps those who receive development assistance on the behalf of southern governments, that development challenges are basically about institutions. They are not now, even if they were perhaps half a century ago, they're not about resource shortages fundamentally. They're about institutional problems with collective action problems underlying them. And we're coming up to a period in which in the UK, I mean, there are going to be big new NGO campaigns about post-2015 and what needs to change in aid. Our research, I think, suggests that this should be the theme of those campaigns and not raising additional resources on the assumption that development is about lack of resources. You may or may not like that proposition, but here's one to finish with. Maybe more development resources should be provided at arm's length through organizations which are capable of acquiring those qualities of local embeddedness, learning capacity, local knowledge. Aid funds maybe should be less used for direct disbursement by development agencies in country. The intervention should be more at arm's length from the embassies and cooperation offices, through organizations that have these features, that they solve problems or they seek to solve problems as they find them on the ground, rather than advancing a prefabricated agenda of reforms and reform ideas. Organizations that don't have responsibility for disbursing funds, because the responsibility for disbursing funds stands in the way of effectively working on institutions. They should be able to use monitoring and planning for learning and adaptation, have technical knowledge, but also facilitation skills, be able to recruit and maintain staff with local knowledge over periods rather more than a typical 3-year posting of an aid advisor. And perhaps in the end be answerable to local stakeholders, not because we want to continue to make a fetish of country ownership of development efforts, but because it's only by being answerable to local stakeholders that the organization will in fact be able to maintain these qualities of local knowledge, adaptive capacity,